This is week 7. This is group denim. Woo woo. And the prompt states, this week's reading focused public leadership and leadership in a crisis. Please discuss ways that you believe organizations can prepare leaders at all levels to respond in a crisis. Consider in this discussion the communication issues faced by BP in the spill and the failures of crisis communication. Go ahead, Kristen.
All right. So when it comes to crisis and crisis communication, I feel that it's so important to have a plan. So in the book,
Josh,
it
come
says
on.
that it's
Josh,
very important
now.
for leaders and just, I guess, companies in general to have a crisis management plan. So in the case of BP, they had a sort of crisis management directory, but they didn't really communicate to each other what they wanted to do, what they wanted to come out of it. So it ended up being such a disaster on their end because they didn't communicate and they didn't think about the plans and the contingencies that can happen in that time frame. So going back to making sure that they have a plan, it says in the book that there should be stages of crisis stages. So when it comes to that, it has to align with your plan. So pre-crisis, making sure that your leaders and stuff, your leaders understand what's going on with what the plan is going to be, that everybody understands it, not just the leaders, but also the employees themselves. Because that way that you'll be more prepared. Stage 2 is crisis event. So when it happens, what are the things that people do, especially the organization, when it comes to that? So turns into damage control. It turns into what are we going to do to communicate to each other? And last but not least is post-crisis. What's after the crisis? What do they do? What are you supposed to do? To be able to communicate to each other, how are they going to go back to normal operations and how they're going to evaluate and reassess and restore the problems and how they can solve these problems in the future. So I think that's it.
All right. Sounds perfect. Donna, you want to go next?
Sure. So, I thought the book really helped define a lot of the different ways that a leader can prepare for a crisis situation, so that they're not like caught off guard by one happening. It a lot of the Hurricane Katrina event and how chaotic and horrible everything was that happened during and after the crisis itself. It's not like Hurricane Katrina was the first hurricane disaster we've ever experienced. So we should have been more prepared for it. But instead of taking needed steps in preparation for the crisis, like stated in the book, they made it exponentially worse by not being prepared. During the crisis itself, all the organizations, like the government organizations that were involved in it, seemed to just kind of point the finger and blame instead of taking responsibility for the situation and trying to correct it immediately. So kind of like what Kristen was saying, so each crisis goes through the different stages. So the first one, the pre-crisis, being the alert and the warning signs. In the case of Katrina and like all hurricanes, we already know that they're coming, so you should have ample amount of time to prepare for them. The second stage is when the actual danger is occurring. At that point, they had already not done a good job by not evacuating like they should have. And then in the third point, the post-crisis, instead of taking a responsibility for what had happened, They spent too much time pointing fingers and placing blame on others instead of looking at what they could do to correct the situation and prepare for any future crisis that might occur that are similar to that event. And in the book, it explains, that once the crisis is over, it's very, very important that you try to get back to business as usual. And in order to do that, you would have to take responsibility for the situation. So for me personally, because I live pretty close to Louisiana, this is where most people evacuated to that did actually evacuate. And then within the year of it happening, we actually had our leadership conference in New Orleans and did a lot of rebuilding and worked with a lot of the people that live there. And so for me, seeing that, the way that it was handled and then the way that it describes in the book on how to handle the situation, maybe they should come read this book because it would have helped a lot.
Yeah,
Hackman. So that was all I have.
This sounds good. Leanne, you're the woman.
Well, and in reading the chapter, one thing that really struck me, and it's probably because of my personality and character, being a perfectionist, I'm very conscientious. So in dealing with crisis, the very first thing that you should do is the prep stage before, which is everybody needs to be knowledgeable. Like, what are we going to do when this happens? They need to know that when we say it's time to go, it's time to go. Or when we implement this plan, like Christina was talking about, everybody needs to know the plan. It's about making sure that everybody knows and we communicate thoroughly that this is what the plan is going to be. And it may change, but this plan is what's going to go forward. Another point that I wanted to make was that, it's not just about the planning, it's about the things that we do in between as well. So once you get to that crisis stage, you have to make impulse decisions, but you also have to be able to make them. You have to make smart decisions, and you have to have a reason why you're making those decisions. Because even if it's not the right decision to make, you did have a valid point in making those decisions, and you learn for the next go round. Donna was talking about with Hurricane Katrina, if they had planned better, if they had communicated better, it would have been more smooth. But then also going forward from that, going to the third step, which is the placing blame. A lot of that, the reason why they place blame is because they don't want to accept responsibility for what happened. And by avoiding responsibility, the reason why they're avoiding that responsibility is because they knew they could have done things differently at first. That's your conscientious point. So for me, it's something that really I can draw from. It's something that I can catch on to because that's who I am in nature. But I think all crises can essentially be averted in most cases. The BP spill could have been averted. Same thing like Donna was talking about with Katrina. It wouldn't have been so disastrous if they had had a plan and they had planned correctly. It wouldn't have cost so many lives. So that's kind of all I had.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up, the responsibility factor. Because nobody wants to take blame when a disaster breaks out. Everybody's trying to shove it on someone else.
Well, it's easier to do that than actually take responsibility.
All right.
But it's the humility part that we learned about in this class that, going to bring forth your leadership skills too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because going back to what you're saying about the whole planning thing, there's something in the book that said something predictable surprises. If you're gonna plan something, if you're gonna plan for a crisis, you have to be able to quote unquote predict what might happen and what other plans do you have after that. If this plan fails, what's your next plan? What's the next one? And everybody, like Leanne said, should know all of the plans from A to Z, because what if this fails? What are you going to do then? You only have that one plan.
Yeah.
You have a plan, then you have a plan B, and then you have the
C, D, F,
unexpected
G.
plan.
Yeah.
Right. The worst case scenario. You have to plan for all of it.
Yes.
Yeah, because
Yep.
like the 9/11, for example, like people were talking about how airport security was so bad back then, and when 9/11 happened, they were like, oh, we should have listened to that. Like that's something that's kind of like a predictable surprise. Like they should have predicted.
Yeah.
They should have tightened security at airports, you know. So
Yeah. Well, what I took from chapter 13 is I actually used it in my leadership interview because that was one of the examples that I used for why I admired the leader that I interviewed, is because being a CNA, you look up to your nurse because you're her assistant. She looks up to you for a lot, and then you look up to her for a lot, and you expect a lot out of her. When a crisis arises, which it normally does in the medical field, you really look to your leader to kind of guide you. And I remember she did, we had like a fire, an actual fire. And before we actually practiced what to do, we were just looking at her like, well, what do we do? Because each facility is different. Each facility has their own protocol and who to contact first. And so the actual layout in the medical field is you're supposed to, it's like an acronym called RACE. And it means the first one, I believe, is rescue. And then after that is alert, and then contain, and then evacuate, or something to that effect. So rescue, so that's the number one thing. So if you remember that, then the other ones kind of fall into place. If you could just remember that, because the rescue is just make sure where the people are. So we had it backwards, and people were calling 911. People were trying to, the E is for extinguish. So people were trying to put out the fire, and nobody was caring about where these patients were. And, all these people are like handicapped and sick, and they can't get downstairs, and the elevators are out of service when there's a fire. So after that disaster that we had, she kind of made sure that that never happened again. Like the next week, she made it a personal goal to go talk to someone and make sure that we had tons of fire drills after that, because seriously. And then we had new staff, so we had no idea what to do. I was new. We had no idea what to do first. And when a fire happens, all the doors shut and they lock. And so, or they all shut. I forget if they lock, but it's just to make sure that you already checked that room. You have to put a bucket or something in the door to make it go ajar. So that brings me to box on page 417, 13.3. It's called the Self-Assessment for Crisis Preparedness and Scale. And it says, to determine how ready your organization is to deal with a crisis, answer yes or no to the following questions. And some of them that I looked on here is, if you look all the way down where it says, let's see. Our organization has backup manufacturing equipment and computers so that it can resume operations as quickly as possible. No, that's not it. There's one of them on here that was pretty much, it reminded me of what happened, because there was a fire extinguisher that was actually expired, and a lot of people don't know that they can do that, and it didn't want to work. So that was, that you're not checking your equipment to make sure that it actually worked properly before the crisis happened. And the second point I want to look at is, if you go down past the box, prediction is it says a quote by Niels Bohr, I want to say, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. So it goes back to what, that's what Kristen was talking about. If you can predict what's going to happen, and if you have a plan, I had a communications teacher one time, he used to teach us life skills, and he said, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So he said, if you don't have a plan, then of course it's going to be overwhelming. But if you have a plan in place, he said that him and his wife got sick at one time, and so were the kids. So, and I'm sure that, you know, Leanne and me know about this. I swear, when you're sick, it feels like, I don't know, because you can't take care of yourself barely, and then you have kids on top of that to take care of. So that's like, if you don't have a plan in place for those issues or those big crises that arise, and you're not gonna it's not gonna be a very good experience. So it just lists a lot of the different crises that can actually arise, and it's like, it says brainstorm a list. So here's the list is like murder, dramatic decrease in enrollment. That's a lot in the medical field. You're like short-staffed. That happens a lot. Explosion in the science lab, faculty members, administration accused of illegal or immoral conduct. That happens a lot. Fire, flood. So, and then it goes down and it shows, I love this, that it shows that you can do like these little activities with, or it says additional techniques that can be used along with brainstorming to help leaders highlight organizational vulnerabilities. And some of them like are little games and stuff that you could play as a group. And I think that's cute because you'll always think back to that because it was fun. So you kind of associate it in your brain. It clicks because you were practically doing it. So one of them is like, say, the wheel of crisis, and it tells you how to do it. It says, build a wheel complete with the spinner, list all the types of crisis that a company or nonprofit can face. Take turns spinning the wheel. When the spinner stops, brainstorm all the kinds of possible crisis that might occur in that category. In a variation of this technique, combine two crises that will drive home the point of the magnitude for potential disaster. So that's really cool. And the other one is down below, says mixed metaphors. Look to another industry to determine if the dangers they face pose a threat to your type of organization. One large electronics manufacturer imagined itself as a part of the food industry. Leaders at this company thought about how bugs and microbes might infect their products. They went so far as to hire an infectious disease specialist to help prevent such infections. So these are kind of little games. Some of them are saying that you kind of like compare yourself to another organization and learn from their mistakes, kind of thing. So that's kind of what I got out of it, to prepare yourself for a disaster or crisis. Anybody have anything, last words to add?
Nope.
No, I like what you added though about learning from others. I think that's actually a very good technique to apply as well.
Mm-hmm. There's nothing like hindsight, right? 2020.
Yeah.
All right, if that's it, then we're signing off and forever. I'll see you guys on the other side. Please hold.